So let's move on to our next panel, and it wouldn't be a TTF Leadership Summit unless we had a group of high-flying journalists giving us a real rundown on what the politics look like. So it's my great pleasure this morning to welcome Matt Killoran, who's the political journalist from the Courier Mail, and Mark Ludlow, the Queensland Bureau Chief of the Australian Financial Review. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, Marty. How are you going?
I'm very well, thank you, and lovely to see both your smiling faces. And no pressure, and no pressure, but I'm expecting highly controversial insights from both of you.
Okay, we'll try our best.
Okay, so let's start at the top of the list. What's going to be the killer-diller issue that makes the difference and pushes things across the line for either Deb Frecklington or Anastasia Palaszczuk? Let's start with you, Mark.
Look, it's quite obvious, all we've been talking about this year is coronavirus, and I think that'll be the prism through this entire election campaign will be viewed. Obviously, the issue of Queensland border closures is quite controversial, as you well know. It might make people feel safe in Queensland, but it's effectively killing a lot of businesses or putting them under a lot of pressure. We thought we were all in the clear in July when the borders were opened up. Obviously, the situation in Melbourne and a few scares in Queensland forced the borders to be closed again. The Premier said yesterday, or it might have been the day before, saying that the borders will be closed as long as there's no community transmission in New South Wales or Victoria. That's a pretty high bar set. So I think the cynic would say that she's going to keep the borders closed right through the election. That's going to give her a boost. But for me, I think they can try and talk about other things like infrastructure or tourism or what else, but I think everything will be coronavirus. And in times of crisis, voters tend to go with the status quo.
Right. Matt, over to you. Oops, we can't hear you, Matt. I think you might be on mute. No?
There we go. Hopefully working this time.
There we go. Excellent. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, technology. I was just saying, Mark's spot on, obviously, when he says the election's going to be viewed through the prism of the coronavirus. Some of the more despondent people within the opposition have suggested that if Queensland remains COVID-free, then Anastasia Palaszczuk will likely be able to retain government. Polls obviously pretty close, but the border closures have been a clear winner for the Premier. She stood by her guns on the initial border closure, despite a fair amount of pressure, and that seemingly has paid off for we've seen Mark McGowan in WA have some huge boost to his popularity for maintaining a hard border, and you don't see that having any different effect here in Queensland. The longer it goes on, is going to cause some more troubles. As Mark alluded to, there's a lot of the difficulty increasingly being felt by business, particularly as the job market starts to wind down. But a lot of that won't really be seen before the election. So other than border and how to manage the health response to COVID, as indicated, some sort of direction, some sort of hope as to the other side to this infrastructure spending. Where are the jobs going to come from? Some sort of campaign around aviation opening up the borders. Once we get to the other side of this, that's where the other part of it's going to come down to jobs. Who's going to be offering where the jobs are going to be coming from?
Mm. I think the other thing that's interesting about this is we've got an election in October in Queensland. We've got one in March in WA. We've got elections in the Northern Territory and in the ACT, and it seems like borders has become the ultimate political question. How do you see that playing out around the country, Matt, beyond Queensland?
I think that's something that everyone's going to be keeping their eye on, because we're going to start seeing how COVID has impacted on politics over the next few months, because we have, as you mentioned, the Northern Territory's got its election coming up quite shortly. Then the ACT follows. New Zealand slightly delayed, but will come in before the election. So we'll see a lot of how much the popularity of leaders through this COVID crisis has followed through to the actual political vote once people actually start casting their ballots. So those upcoming elections are really going to reveal a lot about how popular these border measures are and how much that's going to influence people's votes.
Mark, from your perspective, I mean, I look at Western Australia in particular, and my goodness, what is it, a 90% support level for McGowan in WA at the moment? I mean, it's the ultimate driver of Premier popularity at this point.
Yeah, you'd hope that the political leaders are not deciding to close borders because it's going to boost their popularity. They've got elections coming up, but you've got to be pretty cynical about it all. I think I might have been saying to you on the phone the other day, this COVID crisis has really showed the perverse outcomes that can happen from a federal system. You know, we do have a national government and a national cabinet, but premiers and chief ministers are basically running their states and territories like countries. You know, we will decide who comes into our state and when they come, kind of thing. And I think, you know, WA is basically shut up shop. Northern Territory elections on Saturday, they're saying we're going to keep it closed for 18 months. Anastasia Palaszczuk sort of alluded to the fact that it's going to be till the end of this year. It's a real delicate balance between listening to your health officials, who always are on the side of caution, but the economic damage from closing economies, whether it's tourism in Queensland or elsewhere, is going to be catastrophic. And I think, you know, yes, it might make people feel safe and feel like they're in a great country of Queensland, but I just think the longer you keep borders closed, the more untold economic damage. And yes, tourism businesses are on JobKeeper, but you really wonder, once the tap is switched off in March, how many are actually going to survive the other side.
And look, you know, Queensland is a huge state. I mean, absolutely huge and very diverse. And there is almost, like, much as we don't like to think about it this way, a bit of a divide between far north Queensland and the needs of southeast. I mean, how different do you think the reactions are in the southern part of Queensland as opposed to the far north in terms of the impact on the tourism industry and other businesses, of course, because it's not just the tourism industry that's feeling the pain. I mean, Matt, where do you think that sits in that kind of north-south divide?
Well, certainly up in North Queensland and far North Queensland, the impact of the loss of international tourism and certainly a good chunk of our domestic tourism market is being probably felt more than just about anywhere outside of the Gold Coast. Cairns itself has the second highest number of businesses on JobKeeper in the country, not just in the state, but certainly in the country, something around 10,000 or so. So that employment aspect will have a lot more people worried. Yes, JobKeeper is there, but they will be looking towards longevity and what, as Mark alluded to, you know, what comes up after March and the various other pressures that they're facing. They're building up other forms of debt in the meantime, which will have to be addressed. So that's having that will be playing, I suppose, differently in the states far north. That said, from what I understand, there's a fair bit of polling being done by the parties over time, and border closures do seem to have broad appeal across the state, if only just because people are worried about what happens with this invisible enemy, this COVID, and what happens. They want to make sure it stays out.
So, Mark, north versus south?
Oh, look, it's like when you have the perennial debate about daylight savings. I know when I moved back to Queensland about 15 years ago, it used to drive me nuts that there was not daylight savings. Brisbane was in line with Sydney and Melbourne, and I used to get really fired up about it. But then Beattie and Bligh and Palaszczuk, they were all, and I'm sure if you talked about the economic impact between the north and the south, they always come back to we're one state, we're not going to divide it kind of thing. So I think there's a universal policy there. But you're right, though, there is a big... Look, there might be tourism operators on the Gold Coast or Sunshine Coast. We had a long ECA public holiday, even though the ECA wasn't held this year, and they had booming bookings in Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast. That's because you've got the population base of Brisbane that's in driving distance. But if you're a tourism operator in Cairns who gets most of their business from international tourists that were cut off in February, it's pretty grim up there. People aren't going to hop in the car and drive for 2 days. So there's a real divide between the two. But I think for the moment, in these global pandemic times, people do worry about their safety first. And I don't think they're thinking about the consequences of what this is going to do to the economy. And if the borders are shut and they feel safe, Anastasia Palaszczuk will be happy to take their votes. Whether she deserves a third term is arguable, but she's a known quantity. People tend to like her. So, yeah, I think she'll just go with the flow. She won't be in a hurry to open up at all.
Okay, slightly different topic. So we have an awful lot of transport members and, you know, they're private operators in many instances providing great public transport options in Queensland. I mean, it's a massive transport state with the railway lines and goodness knows what else. You know, just in your observation of what's going on the ground, you know, how confident do you think people are about public transport? I mean, I know there's a huge amount has been done to make people feel confident and great work by the transport agencies, but what do you think is actually happening in terms of people's willingness to travel? Is it all just business as usual? Mark?
Which one? It's you're talking about in terms of travelling and feeling safe on public transport.
Yeah. I mean, what are you hearing from the public? What's it look like?
Well, you know, I think people are on public transport. I always find it funny, or I don't find it funny, but before the potential scare that happened a couple of weeks ago, Queensland had, you know, a long time with no COVID cases. There might have been 5 to 10 active cases. But walking around on the street, you'd think that we were in the middle of a major outbreak in the city. People are watching on TV what's happening in Sydney and Melbourne, and generally Melbourne, where there is genuine issues about an outbreak, and they're just as scared, even though there's not that many COVID cases here. But if you look around the city, people have started to come back. But I think there probably is still genuine fear. My colleague was on the train or bus the other day, and someone started coughing in the back seat, and everyone sort of turned around and started to freak out. So, look, I think the same fears are in Brisbane that there are in Sydney and Melbourne about travelling on public transport. I think I was speaking to a small business owner yesterday, and it all comes back to confidence. In a couple of weeks where there's not many cases, and if you have weeks and weeks and weeks and Victorian situations under control, things will return more to normal. But all it takes is one flare-up about a potential outbreak in Brisbane or Sydney or a third wave in Melbourne, and I think people will be running back into the shelves. And there's a big proportion of people who are still working from home.
Absolutely. Matt, from your obs, are you a public transport user yourself?
Well, I used to be. I'm actually based in Canberra these days, so I can't share any first-hand experiences with what's happening in Brisbane. I'm legally locked out of the state for a while. But certainly speaking to my friends and colleagues up in Brisbane, it certainly does sound like there's just not the same return to business as usual as there was. A lot more people are still working from home, or if they're still travelling into work, they're getting left in with their partner or carpooling to try and avoid public transport, a lot of them, just because there is that fear, particularly after the near miss just a few weeks ago with those girls who returned from Melbourne, and there was a beginning of a cluster. Fortunately, we got on hold with that, but I think that was a stark reminder about how easily things could sort of snowball into what we've seen happen in Melbourne, and to a fortunately much lesser extent in Sydney.
Okay, so I know we're almost out of time, so now I have to ask you the hard question, which is, Matt, who's going to win the election in October in Queensland?
Democracy. From what we're hearing, it sounds like before COVID, there were suggestions it could have been a 50-50 as to who was going to come out on top. COVID has definitely given the Palaszczuk government a chance to shine in terms of sort of showing that leadership, putting up the borders, and that's been a very popular decision that's been made. So I think there's a grim perception within the opposition as to their chances, not written off, but while they might be ahead in the polling, 51-49, it's that seat-to-seat polling where they're looking at, and they're not looking too confidently at those numbers.
Okay, Mark, you get to have the last word. Who's the winner?
Look, if you're a betting person, I'm not, but you'd have to say that Anastasia Palaszczuk is looking pretty safe for a third term. Yes, the news polling is showing that LNP is ahead of Labor, but Palaszczuk is still popular. opposition leader Deb Fredlington has been out there trying her hardest, but she's not cutting through. That's why the rumours were out there a few months ago about her getting rolled before the next election. Look, I think they'll go through the motions of a campaign and they'll talk about different things, but it's, as I said when we started off this conversation, everything will be through the prism of COVID, and who knows what could happen in the next couple of weeks or months. So look, incumbency is great for Palaszczuk. I think it's the biggest advantage. A lot of the average punters might think, oh, you had your time trying to kick someone out, but in times of uncertainty, in times of crisis, I think they'll stick with what they know. She's seen as a safe pair of hands. She's still well liked, especially in regional Queensland, which says a lot for a Labor leader from Brisbane. But yeah, I'd definitely say Palaszczuk's in the box set at the moment.
Okay, well, gentlemen, thank you both very much for your contribution today. We shall look forward to following your work over the next couple of months as we race towards that October deadline. So thank you both again.
No worries. Thank you. Thanks,